The Tonight Show stage was always brightest just before the commercial break ended. On this particular night in December 1982, the lights came up on Johnny Carson's desk, and the audience was still buzzing with laughter from the previous segment. Johnny straightened his tie, glanced at his notes, and then looked toward the curtain with an expression his crew would later describe as curious skepticism. "Our next guest," Johnny said, his voice carrying that familiar mix of charm and doubt, "is a professional wrestler who goes by the name Hulk Hogan." The audience applauded politely, but there was something in the air, a sense that this was going to be different. Not exciting different, not controversial different, just odd. Wrestling was still considered a carnival act in 1982. It didn't belong on The Tonight Show. It didn't belong in the same conversation as the actors, musicians, and authors who usually sat in that chair. And yet, here was Johnny Carson, about to interview a man in a bandana and a tank top, who made his living throwing people across a canvas ring. What happened in the next 12 minutes would change everything. Not just for Hulk Hogan, not just for professional wrestling, but for how America saw strength, showmanship, and the blurred line between performance and reality. To understand what happened that night, you have to understand where professional wrestling stood in 1982. It was territorial, regional, a patchwork of small promotions running high school gyms and armories. Wrestlers were known in their hometowns, maybe their states, but rarely beyond. Television existed, but it was local cable at 2 a.m., grainy footage, small crowds. Wrestling was not mainstream. It was not respectable. And it certainly wasn't something Johnny Carson, the king of late-night television, the man who could make or break careers with a single interview, would normally touch. But Vince McMahon Sr., who ran the World Wrestling Federation at the time, had a vision. Or perhaps more accurately, his son, Vince McMahon Jr., had a vision. They were beginning to see something in a wrestler named Terry Bollea, a 6'7" blonde giant from Tampa, Florida, who had renamed himself Hulk Hogan. He had the size, he had the charisma, he had the tan, the muscles, the smile. He looked like a comic book hero come to life. Still, getting him on The Tonight Show was almost impossible. Carson's producers didn't book wrestlers, they booked stars. But someone, somehow, made the case. Maybe it was the novelty. Maybe it was a slow booking week. Maybe it was the growing whisper that wrestling, as absurd as it seemed, was starting to pull real crowds in the Northeast. Whatever the reason, Hulk Hogan got the call. And on a cold December night in Burbank, California, he walked through the backstage hallways of NBC Studios in a yellow tank top and a red bandana, carrying with him the hopes of an entire industry that didn't yet know it was about to explode. Johnny Carson sat at his desk, shuffling his blue index cards. He had done this thousands of times. He knew how to handle any guest, actors who couldn't talk, politicians who talked too much, musicians who were too high to make sense. But a professional wrestler? That was new territory. Doc Severinsen and the band played a generic entrance theme, not Hogan's music, just standard Tonight Show filler, and then the curtain parted. Hulk Hogan walked out. The audience reaction was mixed. Some applauded, some laughed, some just stared. He was enormous. The camera didn't quite capture it, but in person, Hogan was a giant among men. His arms were the size of most people's legs. His chest stretched the fabric of his tank top. His smile was wide, bright, almost childlike in its enthusiasm. He waved to the crowd, pointed to a few people in the front row, and then sat down in the guest chair next to Johnny's desk. Johnny extended his hand. Hogan shook it. The size difference was immediate and almost comical. Johnny's hand disappeared into Hogan's grip. "Well," Johnny said, leaning back in his chair with a grin that was half amused, half nervous, "you're a big guy." The audience chuckled. Hogan nodded, still smiling. "Yes, sir, Mr. Carson, thank you for having me." There was something disarming about his voice. It wasn't what people expected. It wasn't gruff or menacing. It was polite, almost soft. He called Johnny Mr. Carson with genuine respect, and you could see Johnny pause for a moment, recalibrating. "So," Johnny continued, glancing at his cards, "you're a professional wrestler. Now, I have to ask, because I think everyone wants to know, how much of this is real?" The question hung in the air. It was the question every wrestler dreaded, the question that reduced their craft to a punchline, The question that implied they were frauds, that their work didn't matter, that they were just actors in tights pretending to fight. Hogan didn't flinch. He didn't get defensive. He leaned forward slightly, resting his massive forearms on his knees, and he looked directly at Johnny Carson. "Mr. Carson," he said slowly, "it's real in the sense that everything you see, every move, every fall, every impact, that's happening. We're not faking the physicality. We're not using trampolines or wires. When I pick up a man who weighs 300 pounds and slam him on his back, that's real. When I take a chair to the head, that hurts. The outcomes might be predetermined, but the pain, the risk, the years it takes off your body, that's as real as it gets." The audience went quiet. Johnny Carson, who had been leaning back with a slight smirk, sat up straighter. His expression changed. It wasn't mockery anymore. It was curiosity. "So you're saying," Johnny said carefully, "that you're performing, but you're also actually getting hurt?" "Every night," Hogan said, "sometimes twice a night. We perform, we entertain, we tell stories, but we do it with our bodies, and our bodies pay the price." Johnny nodded slowly. He looked down at his cards, then back up at Hogan. "How often do you wrestle?" 300 nights a year, sir." 300? "Yes, sir. We travel from town to town, different arenas, different opponents. We don't get off seasons. We don't get breaks. If you're hurt, you work hurt. If you're sick, you work sick. Because the moment you stop, someone else takes your spot." Johnny Carson had interviewed thousands of people. He knew when someone was lying, when someone was exaggerating, when someone was playing a character. But in that moment, sitting across from Hulk Hogan, he heard something he didn't expect. The truth. The interview continued for another 8 minutes. Johnny asked about Hogan's training, his diet, his signature moves. Hogan demonstrated how to apply a headlock, gently placing Johnny in the hold while the audience roared with laughter. Johnny played along, hamming it up, pretending to struggle, and when Hogan released him, Johnny sat back down, rubbing his neck with exaggerated drama. "That's just a headlock," Hogan said, grinning. "I didn't even squeeze." "Well, I'm glad," Johnny said, loosening his tie. "I'd like to finish the show tonight." But then Johnny did something unexpected. He turned serious again. "You know," Johnny said, "I've made jokes about wrestling over the years. I've called it fake. I've dismissed it. But sitting here, talking to you, I realize what you guys do is harder than I thought. It's not just about size or strength. It's about endurance. It's about taking punishment night after night and still showing up. I respect that." The audience erupted in applause. Hogan's eyes widened slightly. He nodded, his smile softer now, more genuine. "Thank you, Mr. Carson. That means a lot, more than you know." Johnny extended his hand again. Hogan shook it. The interview was over. As Hogan stood and walked back toward the curtain, waving to the audience, Johnny Carson turned to the camera and said, "Hulk Hogan, ladies and gentlemen, a professional wrestler. And after tonight, I think we all understand that's a real profession." When the cameras stopped rolling, Hogan stood backstage in the hallway outside Studio One. His heart was pounding, not from nerves, not from adrenaline, but from the realization of what had just happened. Johnny Carson, the Johnny Carson, had legitimized professional wrestling on national television. One of the producers walked over, a clipboard in hand, and clapped Hogan on the shoulder. "That was great, really great. Johnny liked you." Hogan nodded, still processing. "He did? He doesn't say things like that unless he means them. You made an impression." In the weeks that followed, the wrestling world began to shift. Promoters noticed, television executives noticed, advertisers noticed. Hulk Hogan's appearance on The Tonight Show wasn't just a novelty, it was a turning point. Suddenly, wrestling wasn't just for kids and blue-collar workers in small towns. It was something that could be discussed on the biggest stage in entertainment. It was something that could be respected. Vince McMahon Jr., who had been quietly planning a national expansion of the World Wrestling Federation, saw the reaction to Hogan's Tonight Show appearance and made a decision. He would build his empire around this man. This blonde giant who could charm Johnny Carson, who could make audiences believe, who could bridge the gap between wrestling and mainstream America. Within 2 years, Hulk Hogan would be the biggest star in professional wrestling. Within 5 years, he would be one of the most recognizable faces in the world. Within a decade, wrestling would be a billion-dollar industry. filling arenas that held 20,000 people, selling out pay-per-view events, becoming a cultural phenomenon. And it all started with 12 minutes on The Tonight Show. Johnny Carson rarely talked about that interview in the years that followed. He didn't need to. But members of his crew remembered it. They remembered the way Johnny looked at Hogan during that conversation, not as a joke, not as a sideshow, but as a man doing a job that required real sacrifice. In 1992, 10 years after that first appearance, Hulk Hogan returned to The Tonight Show. By then, he was a household name. He had headlined WrestleMania. He had been on the cover of Sports Illustrated. He had become exactly what Vince McMahon had envisioned, a crossover star. Johnny welcomed him back with a handshake and a smile. "You've done pretty well since the last time you were here," Johnny said. Hogan laughed. "I owe a lot of it to you, Mr. Carson. That first interview, you treated me with respect. You treated wrestling with respect. That changed everything." Johnny waved it off, modest as always. "I just asked questions. You gave good answers." But Hogan knew the truth, and so did everyone who had watched that night in 1982. Respect is a powerful thing. It can open doors, it can change perceptions, it can take something dismissed as fake and reveal the reality beneath, the hard work, the dedication, the sacrifices made in the name of entertaining people. Johnny Carson gave professional wrestling that respect, and Hulk Hogan carried it into the ring every night for the next 3 decades. There's a lesson in that Tonight Show interview that goes beyond wrestling. It's about what happens when we take the time to see past the surface, when we stop dismissing things we don't understand and start asking questions, when we recognize that every profession, every craft, every form of entertainment requires something from the people who do it: time, effort, pain, passion. Johnny Carson could have mocked Hulk Hogan. He could have made the interview a joke. The audience would have laughed, the ratings would have been fine. But instead he listened. He asked real questions. He gave a man, and an entire industry, a chance to be seen for what they truly were. And in doing so, he helped change the world. That's the magic of The Tonight Show. That's the magic of Johnny Carson. And that's the magic of one December night in 1982, when a wrestler in a yellow tank top sat down in a guest chair and reminded America that respect costs nothing, but it can mean everything.